For 3 years, Nathaniel Harlow carried a key in his shirt pocket. It unlocked the north wing of his house, the rooms he had sealed after his wife died. He told himself he kept the key because he might need it someday. The truth, which he did not examine too closely, was that he was carrying it for someone. He just did not know her name yet. Clara Whitfield arrived from Boston with a stolen train ticket, a satchel packed in darkness, and papers she did not understand, papers that connected her past to his present in ways that were not accidental. She came to a ranch that was being quietly dismantled from the inside. She stayed to fight for it. And somewhere between the burned breakfast she fixed on her first morning and the legal confrontation in the yard that changed everything. A man who had stopped believing in the future put a key on a counter and asked her if she would stay. This channel tells the stories of the American West, loyalty tested by hardship, love built slowly and kept honestly, and the courage of ordinary people in extraordinary moments. What this story teaches is that the bravest thing you can do is hand someone the key to the room you have been keeping locked and trust that they will walk through it gently. If this story touched something in you, leave a comment below. Share it with someone who deserves to hear it. Like it if you believe in the kind of love that is built rather than found. And subscribe to this channel because every week there is a new story, and every story is worth your time.
The morning I left Boston, I took 3 things that did not belong to me. The first was a leather satchel stuffed with clothes I had packed in the dark while Dominic's household slept. The second was a train ticket purchased with money I had been quietly setting aside for 11 months, ever since I began to understand what kind of man I had promised myself to. The third was a bundle of papers I had pulled from the unlocked drawer of Dominic Ashford's mahogany desk at 2 in the morning. Papers I did not fully understand but knew, with a certainty that lived in my bones rather than my mind, that I should not leave behind. My name is Clara Whitfield. I am 26 years old. I was, until 48 hours before that train departed, the respected fiancée of one of Boston's most celebrated young financiers. I had a wardrobe, a social calendar, and a future that other women in my circle would have traded their pearls to possess. I left all of it on a Tuesday. The reason was not complicated, though the emotions surrounding it were. I had been introduced, quite deliberately and without any kindness whatsoever, to a woman named Sylvia Grant. Sylvia was beautiful in the way expensive things are beautiful, polished and cold and designed to impress. She had come to find me at the tea room where I met my friend Helen every Thursday afternoon. She sat down across from me without being invited, ordered nothing, and told me in a voice as calm as a winter pond that she and Dominic had been conducting what she called a private arrangement for the better part of 2 years. She was not angry. She was not cruel. She was simply tired of waiting for Dominic to handle the situation himself, and she had decided to handle it for him. I listened. I finished my tea. I thanked her, which seemed to confuse her considerably. Then I went home, packed in the dark, took the papers, and bought a ticket on the first westbound train that would put a meaningful number of miles between myself and everything I had known. My mother's cousin had written to me once about a town in Arizona Territory called Sulphur Creek. She had a friend there, a woman named Ruth Calloway, who was connected to most of the local families. The letter had mentioned, almost as an aside, that a rancher outside town was in desperate need of a cook after his last one had quit without notice. I had laughed at that letter when I received it 6 months earlier. I did not laugh now. I spent the first 2 hours of the journey staring out the window at the city dissolving into countryside, feeling something I could not immediately name. It took me until we crossed into Connecticut to identify it. Relief, not grief, not rage. Relief, clean and sharp, like the first breath after a long time underwater. I reached into my satchel and pulled out the bundle of papers I had taken from Dominic's desk. The train car was nearly empty at that early hour, and the light was gray and thin through the window. I unfolded the top document and tried to read it. The language was dense with financial and legal terminology I did not have the training to parse. Words like encumbrance and promissory instrument and collateralized transfer swam in front of my eyes until I gave up and folded everything back together. Whatever these papers were, they were significant enough that Dominic kept them in a locked drawer in a room he did not invite guests into. That was enough for now. I tucked them to the bottom of the satchel, beneath my extra shirtwaist, and the small photograph of my mother that I carried everywhere. Outside, the world was getting wider. I pressed my hand flat against the cold glass of the window and watched Boston disappear, and I made myself a promise that I have kept every day since. I would not shrink. I had spent 11 months making myself smaller, quieter, more agreeable, more decorative. I had bent myself into shapes that did not fit me, because I believed that was what love required. I was done bending. The train carried me southwest for 4 days, through landscapes that grew increasingly vast and red and indifferent to human drama. By the time we reached Arizona territory, I had stopped looking behind me and started looking forward. The sky here was enormous. It pressed down on the red earth like a hand, vast and blue, and entirely unconcerned with the troubles of a Boston woman on a westbound train. I arrived in Sulphur Creek on a Thursday evening, just as a storm was building over the mountains to the east. The platform was nearly empty. I stepped down from the car with my satchel in one hand and my letter of introduction in the other, and I looked around at a town that was nothing like Boston, and everything I had not known I needed. And then I saw him. He was standing at the far end of the platform, not waiting for anyone, or at least not appearing to. A tall man, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of stillness that came not from peace, but from practice. His hat was pulled low against the coming rain. He did not look at me. He looked like a man who had stopped expecting anything from arriving trains a long time ago. I had no way of knowing, standing there with my satchel and my stolen papers and my fragile new resolution, that this was Nathaniel Harlo. That this was the man whose ranch I was heading to, that this quiet, weathered, unreachable man was about to become the center of everything. The storm broke as I hailed the livery driver, and the rain came down on Sulphur Creek like it meant to wash the whole town clean. I rather hoped it would. Ruth Calloway met me at the door of her house on the edge of town before I had even climbed down from the livery cart. She was a woman of perhaps 40, with red hair going silver at the temples and eyes the color of creek water, sharp and clear and amused by most things. She took one look at me, soaking wet with my satchel clutched to my chest, and said, "You're Clara Whitfield. You're smaller than I expected, and you look like you haven't slept in 4 days." "3.5," I said. She laughed and pulled me inside. Ruth fed me, dried me out in front of her fire, and told me everything I needed to know about Harlo Ranch and its owner over a pot of strong coffee that I will be grateful for until my dying day. She did not soften anything, which I appreciated. "Nate Harlo built that ranch from nothing," she said, wrapping her hands around her mug. "Came out here with his father when he was 19, nothing but a horse and a head full of plans. His father passed 5 years back and left him the land and a set of debts neither of them talked about openly. Nate's been running it alone ever since, except for his hands." "And his wife?" I asked, because the letter had mentioned a wife in passing. Ruth's expression shifted just slightly. "Eleanor Harlo. She died 3 years ago. Riding accident, they said." She paused on those last 2 words in a way that left space for questions I did not yet know how to ask. "Nate hasn't been what you'd call himself since then. The ranch runs because he works himself half to death keeping it running. But the house," she shook her head, "the house feels like something got the life sucked out of it. You'll see." I saw the next morning when the livery driver took me out the 12 miles of red dirt road to Harlo Ranch. The land was extraordinary. Whatever else I might say about that place, and I have said a great deal, the land was extraordinary. The ranch sat in a wide valley between 2 sets of hills that turned gold in the morning light. And the grass in the lower pastures was good and thick, and the cattle that dotted the hillsides were healthy and well kept. Someone loved this land and worked it with care. The house was another matter. It was a large adobe structure, solid and well built, with a deep porch running the length of the front face. It had clearly been fine once. The bones of it were beautiful. But the windows had not been cleaned in some time, and the porch needed sweeping, and the flower beds along the front wall had gone to weeds months or years ago, and the whole impression was of a place holding its breath. waiting for something it no longer believed was coming. A man came out of the barn as the cart pulled up. He was exactly as I remembered from the platform, though seeing him in daylight added details. Sun-darkened skin, deep-set eyes the color of dark timber, a jaw that seemed permanently set against something. He moved with the efficiency of a man who had learned long ago that unnecessary motion was wasted energy. He looked at me the way you look at a piece of equipment someone has delivered that you did not precisely order but have agreed to evaluate. "Miss Whitfield," he said, not a question. "Mr. Harlo," I said. "I understand you need a cook." "I need someone who won't quit inside a month," he said. "I've had 3 since spring." "I don't quit," I said, which was almost entirely true. He considered me for a moment with those dark eyes, then picked up my satchel from the cart before I could reach for it. "Kitchen's through the back. Stores are low. I'll show you the cottage." The cottage was small and clean, a separate adobe structure perhaps 80 yards from the main house. 1 room, a small sleeping alcove, a fireplace, and a window that faced east and would catch the morning sun. It had clearly belonged to someone before me. There were small signs of previous habitation, a hook on the wall where a coat had hung, a faded square on the floor where a rug had been. "This suits me very well," I said. Nate Harlo looked around the cottage as though seeing it fresh, and something moved briefly through his expression that I could not read. "Breakfast is before first light. The hands eat at dawn, noon, and sunset. There are 4 of them. Silas, the oldest, has a bad stomach, nothing too rich. Young Walt can eat anything and usually tries to." He paused. "Any questions?" "Just one," I said. "What do you take in your coffee?" He blinked. It was, I would come to learn, a rare thing to make Nathaniel Harlo blink. "Black," he said. "Good," I said. "That's the right answer." He left without another word. The kitchen was worse than I'd expected and better than Ruth had prepared me for. It was large, at least, with good light and a solid stove that only needed cleaning and proper adjustment. The stores were genuinely low, but workable. I found flour, dried beans, salt pork, cornmeal, 3 eggs, half a side of smoked beef, and enough dried herbs to make something edible. I made supper that first night that was simple but real, a beef and bean stew with cornbread, and a dried apple pudding that used the last of a jar of preserves I found in the back of a cupboard. The 4 ranch hands, Silas, Walt, Earl, and a quiet young man named Clem, who could not have been more than 18, came in from the day's work and stopped in the doorway as though they had walked into the wrong building. "Lord in heaven," said Silas, who was perhaps 60 and had the face of a man who had eaten bad food for a very long time. "That smells like actual food." "It is actual food," I said. "Now sit down." "Sit." They sat. They ate. They were deeply, genuinely grateful in the way that only very hungry people can be. Walt asked if there was more cornbread 3 times. Clem ate 2 full bowls without looking up. Nate Harlo ate at the end of the table, apart from the others in some quality that had nothing to do with physical distance. He ate everything on his plate. He said nothing. When he was done, he pushed back his chair and walked out, and the door closed behind him with a quiet, final sound. Silas watched him go, and then looked at me with something like apology in his weathered eyes. "Don't take it personal, miss," he said. "He used to be different." "Most people used to be something," I said, and started clearing the table. That night, long after the house had gone quiet, I went back to the kitchen to check the bread I had set to rise for morning. The house was dark except for the low glow of the banked stove. I moved quietly, not wanting to wake anyone. I almost missed him. He was sitting in the far corner of the kitchen in the darkest part of the room at the small table by the window, not doing anything, just sitting, one hand around a cup that had gone cold, the other flat on the table. In his expression, in the unguarded silence of 2 in the morning, was something I had not seen in his face during the day. Not coldness, not distance, just grief. The kind that has settled in so deep it has become structural, the way rot can become structural in old wood, the kind that has given up on being seen because being seen has not helped. I stood very still in the doorway and did not say anything, and after a moment I went back to my cottage without disturbing him. I lay awake for a long time after that, not thinking about Dominic for the first time in days, thinking instead about what it must be like to grieve so completely and so privately in the dark of your own kitchen that the grief had become the house itself. I pulled my satchel from under the cot and took out the bundle of papers. I unfolded them in the light of my small lamp and tried again to read them. The financial language was still dense and largely impenetrable, but this time I was slower, more careful, and one phrase snagged my attention and would not let go. Harlo Ranch, Sulphur Creek, Arizona Territory. I read it 3 times. Then I read the name at the bottom of the page. Dominic Ashford, principal creditor. I sat there in the lamplight of my small cottage at the edge of a ranch I had arrived at that same day, and I thought about the fact that nothing in my life was a coincidence, and that the papers I had taken in blind panic from a locked drawer in Boston had somehow led me to the very place they described. I did not sleep at all that night. I did not tell Nate what I had found in the papers, not yet. Partly because I did not fully understand what I had found. Partly because telling him would require explaining where the papers had come from and why I had them, and that explanation would unravel things I was not ready to unravel. But mostly because what I had read, that single reference to Harlo Ranch beneath Dominic's name, could mean several things, and I needed to understand which thing it meant before I opened my mouth. So, I cooked instead, which is what I have always done when I need to think. The first week passed in the rhythm of the kitchen. I was up before 4 each morning, building the fire, setting the coffee, starting whatever I had planned for breakfast. The ranch hands came in with the dawn and went out again, and the work of feeding them gave me the kind of purpose I had been missing for longer than I wanted to admit. Nate was present at meals and absent everywhere else, which suited us both for a while. It was the horse that changed things. On the 8th morning, I was carrying a bucket of kitchen scraps to the compost heap behind the barn when I heard the sound, a sharp crack of hooves against wood, and then a high, frantic whinnying that cut across the morning air like a blade. I dropped the bucket and went around the corner of the barn without thinking. There was a horse in the near corral, a young gray mare, pressed against the far fence with her eyes showing white and her whole body trembling. She had gotten her lead rope tangled somehow, and the more she pulled against it, the tighter it wound, and the sound of her own confinement was frightening her further into panic. Walt was at the fence, looking uncertain. Clem was standing back with his hat in his hands. I ducked through the fence rails before either of them could say anything. "Miss Clara, you shouldn't. She's likely to," Walt started. I was already walking toward the mare, slowly, not directly, but at an angle, the way you approach something frightened. I started talking, not words exactly, just sound, low and steady and unhurried, the tone you use when you want something living to understand that you are not a threat. The mare's ears swiveled toward me. Her trembling did not stop, but it changed quality, from blind panic to something more like wary attention. I kept walking, kept talking. When I was close enough, I reached up slowly and laid my hand flat on her neck, and I felt the fear in her like electricity moving through muscle. And I kept my hand there, and kept talking and kept breathing at the same rate I wanted her to breathe. It took perhaps 4 minutes. Then she lowered her head, just slightly, and the trembling eased, and I was able to reach the tangled rope and work it free with my other hand, without startling her. She blew out a long breath. I blew out a long breath. We regarded each other. "Good girl," I said. "There now. All done." I turned around and found Nathaniel Harlo standing at the fence. He had come from somewhere, the barn perhaps, and he was watching me with an expression I had not seen on his face before. Not the blank efficiency he wore during meal times. Not the closed, careful distance of a man who has decided feelings are inefficient. Something more like, I do not have a better word for it, recognition. He did not say anything. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he looked at the mare. Then he turned and walked back into the barn. That evening after supper, he stayed at the table after the hands had gone. This was new. I was washing up at the basin with my back to the room, and I heard his chair shift and thought he was leaving, but when I turned, he was still there, turning his coffee cup in slow circles on the table. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked. "With the horse." "My grandfather had a farm in western Massachusetts," I said. "He believed that animals and people are afraid of the same things. The unexpected, the thing they cannot see coming. He said, if you can be the thing they can predict, they will eventually trust you." Nate was quiet for a moment. "Smart man." "He was," I said. "He also made terrible coffee, so no one is without flaws." Something happened at the corner of Nate's mouth. It was not quite a smile, but it was the nearest thing to one I had seen from him. I pushed my advantage. Not deliberately, exactly, but the thought was there, and the words came out before I had fully decided to say them. "I changed the noon meal schedule," I said. "I've been serving the hands earlier so they have time to rest in the heat of the day before going back out. I know you said no changes without discussion, but the original schedule had them working through the worst of the afternoon on empty stomachs, and 2 of them were slowing down by 3 o'clock. The almost smile disappeared. "I said no changes without discussion." "Yes," I said, "and I'm discussing it now. After making the change, which I understand was backwards, but the results have been better and I'd like to keep doing it." He looked at me across the kitchen with those dark, assessing eyes. "You're telling me you made a decision about my ranch without asking." "I made a decision about my kitchen," I said. "That affected your ranch, and I'm prepared to argue that the difference matters." He was silent for a long moment. Then, "Keep the new schedule, but next time discuss it first." "Yes," I said, "I will." He left. I stood in the kitchen with my heart going considerably faster than the conversation warranted, and I thought that this was either the beginning of something or the end of my employment, and I could not entirely tell which. It was neither. It was, as I would understand much later, the moment Nathaniel Harlo decided I was worth paying attention to. 3 days later, a letter arrived. It came with a supply wagon from town, tucked among the legitimate mail, no return address. I recognized the handwriting before I had fully registered what I was looking at. Dominic's script was distinctive, all sharp angles and controlled pressure, like everything about him. Inside was one sentence. "I know where you are. Come home before I have to come and get you." I stood in the kitchen doorway holding the letter, and I was aware of several things simultaneously. The way the morning light fell across the red dirt of the yard, the sound of cattle in the far pasture, the smell of the coffee on the stove, the feeling of my own heart, steady and measured, which surprised me. I had expected fear to arrive like a wave. Instead, it arrived like a cold stone settling somewhere deep and quiet. I folded the letter. I held it over the open door of the stove. I watched it burn. Then I went back to making breakfast. I did not tell Nate. Not yet. I needed to think, and I thought best when my hands were busy, and there was always something to be done in a kitchen the size of Harlo Ranch. But that night, when the house was quiet, I went back to the papers. I had been working through them slowly, a few pages at a time, copying out the terms I did not understand and asking Ruth about them on my weekly afternoon in town. Ruth was sharper about financial matters than her easy manner suggested, and she had been pointing me toward the right questions even when she did not know the answers. That night I found the document I had been dreading. It was a promissory note. The borrower was listed as Robert Harlo, Nate's father. The lender was a company called Ashford Capital Partners, which was Dominic's firm. The amount was substantial. The date was 7 years ago. And at the bottom, in a different hand and a different ink, was a transfer clause. Upon the death of Robert Harlo, the obligation transfers in full to his heir, Nathaniel James Harlo. Nate had inherited his father's debt to Dominic without knowing the name of the man he owed. I sat with that for a very long time. Then I went to find the next document, and the one after that, and by the time the lamp oil ran low, I had found what I had been looking for and dreading in equal measure. The due date on the note was 60 days from a date that was already 3 weeks past. Dominic had not come for me. He had come for the ranch, and I had walked straight into the middle of it. I told Ruth everything on my next afternoon in town. We sat in her kitchen with coffee and a plate of biscuits she had made that morning, and I spread the copied notes across her table and laid out what I understood and what I did not. Ruth listened without interrupting, which was one of her finer qualities. When I was done, she sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "Nate doesn't know?" she said. "Not about Dominic specifically. He knows there's debt on the land. He's been paying against it. But the name on the original note is buried in company language. I don't think he knows who actually holds it." "And the due date?" 37 days from today," I said. Ruth looked at me steadily. "Clara, you have to tell him." "I know," I said. I'm trying to find the right way." "There isn't a right way," she said. "There's just telling him and not telling him." She was correct. She usually was. I went back to the ranch that afternoon and spent 3 days working up to the conversation I needed to have. During those 3 days, 2 things happened that complicated my already complicated feelings considerably. The first was the riding lesson. Nate offered it without preamble on a Wednesday morning, appearing at the kitchen door while I was in the middle of bread dough and saying, "You can't ride properly, I'll teach you this afternoon." "I can ride," I said. "Not like that," he said, which was fair. My riding was the decorative Boston variety, side saddle and sedate, designed for parks and promenades. That afternoon he put me on a sturdy quarter horse named Buck and proceeded to demonstrate with patient and largely wordless efficiency the difference between riding for appearance and riding for use. He adjusted my posture by placing his hands on my shoulders from behind, and I was extremely grateful that he could not see my face in that moment. He corrected my grip on the reins by reaching around and repositioning my hands, and his were rough and warm and careful, and I kept my breathing deliberately steady. Buck was tolerant of my learning curve. Nate was remarkably patient for a man who usually expressed impatience through silence. "Better," he said when I had managed a correct canter 3 times in succession. Coming from Nathaniel Harlo, this was extravagant praise. "Thank you," I said. "You're a good teacher." "You're a quick learner," he said, and looked away at the hills. And I understood that this was as close to a personal exchange as he was comfortable with for now. The second thing that happened was more significant. We rode out together on Thursday to check a section of fence in the eastern pasture, just the 2 of us, because the hands were occupied with a problem in the north barn. It was the first time I had been truly alone with Nate beyond the kitchen, out in the open land he had spent his adult life building. We found the fence section, and it was fine, and on the way back we stopped at the creek that ran through the lower pasture, letting the horses drink. The afternoon was clear and very warm, and the water was green and quick over smooth stones, and somewhere upstream a bird was making a sound I had no name for. "You built all of this," I said. Not a question. "My father started it," Nate said. "I finished it." "What was his dream for it?" He was quiet for a moment. He wanted to leave something that would last. He'd had nothing growing up, truly nothing, and he wanted to know that what he built would still be standing after he was gone. "Is that your dream, too?" He looked at the water. It was. "What happened to it?" He did not answer immediately, and I thought I had pushed too far. Then he said, "Some things that burn down burn for a reason. I've been trying to figure out if this is one of those things or not." I thought about that for a while. The horses drank, the birds sang. "What would you build," I asked, "if you were starting over, knowing what you know now?" He turned to look at me with an expression that was not the guarded distance of the kitchen table. It was something more open and more careful at the same time, as though the question had found a door he had forgotten existed. Something real, he said finally. Something I could share. The land is good. It's always been good. I think I've been tending it alone for so long I forgot it was supposed to be for something. I looked at him and thought about what Ruth had told me about Eleanor, about the 3 years of solitary grief and relentless work. I thought about the man in the dark kitchen turning a cold cup in his hands. "I need to tell you something," I said. And then we heard hoofbeats on the road, and Clem came riding fast with news about a problem with the south water line, and the moment closed before I could open it. That evening, Ruth came by the ranch on her way back from visiting a neighbor, which she did sometimes, and she found me on the cottage porch and sat down without being asked, which was her way. "Rex Dunmore is in town," she said without preamble. I went still. "Who is Rex Dunmore?" "I don't know his business exactly. He arrived on yesterday's stage, paid for a week at the boarding house with money from back east, you can tell by the bills. He's been asking questions in town about the ranch, about you." She looked at me directly. "He didn't give your name, Clara. He described you." I did not say anything for a moment. The evening was warm and the fireflies were beginning in the long grass, and everything was very beautiful, and I was very afraid. "He works for Dominic," I said. "He's a private investigator. I've seen him twice at Dominic's office in Boston. He's not a kind man." Ruth absorbed this. "Then you need to tell Nate. Tonight." "I know," I said. But I did not tell him that night because something else happened first that changed the shape of everything. I went to the kitchen late, as I often did, to check on things. The lamp was lit at the back table, and Nate was there. But this time he was not turned away into the dark. He was reading something, a letter by the look of it, and his face was visible in the lamplight. And what I saw there stopped me in the doorway. He looked hollowed out, not sad. Past sad. The way a place looks after the furniture has been removed, all the echoing spaces where things used to be. He looked up and saw me and did not immediately reassemble his expression, which told me he was more tired than he usually allowed himself to be. "I'm sorry," I said. "I'll go." "You don't have to," he said. So I made coffee, and we sat at the table, and we did not talk about the letter or what was in it. And after a while, the quiet became comfortable in a way that surprised me. "She liked this kitchen," he said, out of nothing, without looking up from his cup. "Eleanor. She used to say it was the best room in the house. She spent a lot of time in here." I did not say anything. I let the silence hold space. "I haven't been able to be in here much," he said. "Since." "And now?" I asked quietly. He looked up then, and met my eyes, and something passed between us that was not words and did not need to be. "Now is different," he said. "I thought about Rex Dunmore in town and Dominic's letter and the papers under my cot, and I thought, tomorrow, I will tell him tomorrow. Let tonight be what it is." Dominic Ashford arrived at Harlo Ranch on a Thursday morning in September, and he arrived beautifully. That was always one of his gifts, the ability to arrive beautifully, to compose his entrance so that the first impression was exactly what he intended. He rode up the main road on a hired horse that was far too good for the terrain, wearing traveling clothes that managed to be both practical and expensive, with a smile already arranged on his face like a painting he had decided to display. I saw him from the kitchen window, and the stone dropped into my stomach again, cold and final. I had told Nate about the papers the previous evening. Not everything, but enough. I had laid out what I had found, the promissory note, the transfer clause, the due date, and the connection to Dominic's firm. I had told him about the letter. I had not yet told him about Rex Dunmore or about the full extent of what I suspected, that my presence here might not have been coincidence. Nate had listened with a stillness that was different from his usual stillness. This one had weight in it. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time, and then he said, "You've had these papers since Boston." "Yes." "And you didn't tell me when you arrived." "I didn't understand them fully when I arrived." And then when I did understand, I was trying to find the right way. He looked at me steadily. There's something else you're not telling me. I hesitated. Yes, but I need a little more time to be sure before I say it. He did not push. That restraint, I thought, was one of the things that made him who he was. And now Dominic was riding up the front road, and whatever time I had was gone. Nate was in the yard when Dominic dismounted. I came out behind him and stood slightly to his left, and Dominic's eyes moved from Nate to me, and something flickered in them that was proprietary and cold, before his smile adjusted to include both of us. "Good morning," Dominic said pleasantly. "I'm Dominic Ashford from Boston. I understand you're Nathaniel Harlo. I believe we have some business interests in common." Nate shook his hand without warmth. "Mr. Ashford, I know the name from my father's papers." "Then you know we have matters to discuss," Dominic said. He turned to me with an expression of warm, practiced concern. "Clara, you look well. The Western air agrees with you." "What are you doing here, Dominic?" I said. "I came to discuss the loan with Mr. Harlo," he said, "and to give you one more opportunity to be reasonable about returning to Boston." He said it pleasantly, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. "We can resolve everything quite neatly if we approach this sensibly." "Yeah. She's employed here," Nate said. His voice was quiet. "Her choices are her own." Dominic turned his full attention to Nate, and the pleasantness in his face shifted quality slightly, becoming something more focused and more deliberate. "Of course," he said. "I don't mean to interfere in your household arrangements, Mr. Harlo. I only mean that there may be a resolution to our financial situation that benefits everyone involved, and I'd like the chance to discuss it." Nate looked at Dominic for a long moment with those dark, quiet eyes. "Come inside," he said. "We'll talk." I started to follow. Dominic touched my arm lightly and said, "Clara, if you wouldn't mind, this is a business discussion." "She stays," Nate said without turning around. Dominic's hand fell away. The conversation at the kitchen table lasted 2 hours. Dominic was smooth and reasonable and meticulous, laying out the terms of the note, the transfer clause, the current balance, the due date. He had figures and documents, and a manner that suggested he was doing Nate a great favor by visiting personally rather than sending lawyers. He proposed an extension, 60 additional days, in exchange for a minority stake in the ranch's cattle operation. It was a reasonable-sounding proposal that was not reasonable at all, as anyone who understood the language of minority stakes and the leverage they created would know. Nate listened without expression. I sat slightly behind and to the left of Dominic and watched his face and thought about everything I knew and did not know. When Dominic finished, Nate said, "I'll need time to review this with counsel." "Of course," Dominic said. "I'll be staying in town for several days. I look forward to continuing our discussion." He stood, adjusted his jacket, and turned to me. "Clara, I hope you'll reconsider. There's no reason for this to be difficult." "There's every reason," I said. After he left, Nate and I sat at the kitchen table in silence for a moment. "He's not here for the money," I said. "He could collect on the debt through lawyers without traveling from Boston. He came here for the ranch." Nate looked at me. "And for you." "He wants the ranch," I said. "He wants me to be a complication that goes away. Those are two separate goals that he's been managing simultaneously." "You were going to tell me something else," Nate said. "The other night. You said there was something you weren't sure of yet." I looked at him across the table and took the leap. "I think my being here might not have been coincidence," I said. "I think Dominic may have arranged it. My cousin's letter, the recommendation to Ruth, the connection to this ranch. I don't know how deeply it was planned, but I think I was meant to come here as a reason for him to follow." Nate was very still. "I came because I was running from him," I said. "I thought I was running to safety. But I may have run exactly where he needed me to be." I met his eyes. "I'm sorry. If that's true, then I've brought this to your door and you deserve to know it. The silence lasted a long time. Then Nate said, "Are you staying?" I blinked. "What?" "Are you staying?" he repeated. "On the ranch? Or are you going back with him?" "I'm not going back," I said. "I will never go back." He nodded once. "Then we deal with this together." He stood up. "I'm going to town to see the lawyer tomorrow. I'd like you to bring the papers." "Yes," I said. "All of them," he said. "Everything you have." "Yes," I said again. He walked toward the door and then stopped with his hand on the frame, not looking at me. "Clara," he said. "Yes?" "Thank you for telling me." He left, and I sat in the kitchen for a long time, and the afternoon light moved slowly across the floor. And somewhere in the distance I could hear cattle and wind and the ordinary sounds of a working ranch. And I thought that if I had to bring this trouble to a doorstep, I was glad it had been this one. Two things happened in the week that followed Dominic's arrival that I need to tell together because they are wound around each other in a way that makes separating them feel dishonest. The first was Victoria Ashford. She arrived 3 days after her brother, traveling alone on the stage from Tucson, and she presented herself at the ranch with a letter of introduction addressed to Nate that she had apparently had the audacity to write herself. She was perhaps 28, dark-haired like Dominic, with a kind of studied prettiness that was designed to be noticed. She told Nate, smoothly and without apparent embarrassment, that she had been a friend of Eleanor's from their school days in Philadelphia. Nate's face did something complicated when she mentioned Eleanor's name. He let her come inside. I watched Victoria Ashford move through the main house of Harlo Ranch with the eyes of someone conducting an appraisal. She was good at it, subtle enough that you might not notice unless you were watching specifically for it. She noticed the quality of the furniture, the size of the rooms, the view from the east window. She noticed all of this and commented instead on the charm of the place, the lovely proportions, the wonderful light. She also watched Nate the way a person watches something they have decided to possess and are waiting for the right moment to reach for. I said nothing. I went back to the kitchen and made dinner, and thought very carefully about everything I was seeing. She found me alone in the kitchen that afternoon while the men were out and Nate was in his office with correspondence. She came in without being invited and sat at the table and said, "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" I asked, not stopping what I was doing. "Someone softer," she said. "My brother usually selects soft women for his schemes. They're easier to manage." I turned from the stove and looked at her directly. She smiled, and it did not reach her eyes. "He chose the setting very carefully, you know. The letter from your cousin, the recommendation to Mrs. Calloway, the connection to this ranch. He needed a reason to come here that wasn't about money, because men like Nathaniel Harlo close their doors to financial predators. But a man like that might open his door for a woman in trouble." She tilted her head. "He chose you because he thought you would stay soft. He was wrong about that, I think." I was very still. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because," she said, "my brother doesn't know I'm telling you, and I'm tired of his games." Something moved through her expression that was genuine, briefly, before she put the smooth surface back in place. "I had my own reasons for coming here. Nate Harlo and I have history that goes back further than Eleanor. He won't remember it the way I do. They never do." She stood up. "I'm telling you this because I think you should know what you're in the middle of. What you do with it is your business." She walked out. I stood in the kitchen for a long moment, holding a wooden spoon and thinking very fast. Then I heard a sound from outside, from the side of the house, and something about it was wrong in a quality I could not immediately name, and I went to the window. Rex Dunmore was walking away from the cottage. He did not hurry. He did not look up at the house. He walked with the unhurried purpose of a man who has just completed a task and has no reason to feel watched. I went to the cottage. The papers were gone. Not the originals. I still had those, tucked between the pages of the book I kept on the small table by my cot, exactly where I had put them. But the copies I had made, the versions with my handwritten notes in the margins, the ones I'd been working from, those were gone. I stood in the middle of the cottage and looked at the empty space, and felt something clarify inside me that had been gathering for weeks. I was done being moved around like a piece on someone else's board. That evening I found Nate in his office after dinner. He looked up when I came in. "Sit down," I said, which was perhaps not the most deferential way to begin a conversation in someone else's house, but he sat. I told him about Victoria's visit, about what she had said, about Rex Dunmore and the missing copies. I told him all of it without softening or editing, and when I was done I put the originals on his desk. "These are what Rex took copies of," I said. "He doesn't know I have the originals, and he doesn't know I made a second set of copies that are with Ruth in town." Nate looked at the papers on his desk. He looked at me. "You made 2 sets of copies." "I made the first copies before I fully understood what I had," I said. "I made the second set last week after Dominic arrived, because I thought someone might try to take the first set." "You thought someone might break into your cottage and steal documents." "I thought Dominic might send someone to do it, yes." Nate was quiet for a long moment. "So he has copies of documents that you also have copies of, and he doesn't know that." "Correct." He leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. Then he looked back at me. "That's the most useful thing anyone has done for this ranch in 3 years," he said. And then, quite unexpectedly, with all of this weight between us, he told me about Eleanor. Not everything, but enough. He told me that the marriage had not been good for a long time before she died, that Eleanor had been unhappy in ways he had not known how to reach, that she had wanted things from their life together that the ranch could not provide, that he had thought over time she would come to love the land as he loved it, and he had been wrong. He told me that when she died, he had believed, on some deep and stubborn level, that it was his failure, that he had not been enough, had not known how to be enough. He told me this quietly, looking at the papers on his desk, and I listened without saying anything until he was done. Then I said, "Nathaniel." He looked up. "You can love something with your whole heart and still not be the right fit for it," I said. "That's not failure. That's just the truth sometimes." He looked at me for a long time in the lamplight. "I'm going to tell you something," he said, "that I haven't said to anyone." "All right," I said. "Some days," he said, "it's harder to be in this house than to just be out on the land where things make sense. And some days, since you came, it's been easier to be in the house." The room was very quiet. "I'm glad," I said. We sat in the office for another hour going through the papers together, and by the time I went back to the cottage, the weight that had been sitting on my chest for weeks had shifted into something that felt more like readiness. The next morning, Dominic called on Nate with a revised proposal. Nate listened, thanked him for his time, and said he needed to review the terms further. Dominic smiled and said he understood perfectly. That afternoon, Dominic asked me to walk with him in the yard away from the house. "Come home, Clara," he said. "This has gone on long enough. I'll pay off the note on this place, rip it up in front of you. The man keeps his ranch. You come home, everyone wins." I looked at him in the afternoon light, this man I had once believed I loved, and I thought about what it would mean to go back. The social calendar, the charity committees, the careful, managed life, the version of myself that fit inside it. "No," I said. His expression did not change. "Think carefully." "I have thought carefully," I said. "More carefully than I ever thought about anything in Boston. The answer is no." Something moved behind his eyes that was colder than anything he had shown me before. "You're making this complicated," he said. "You made it complicated," I said. "I'm just refusing to smooth it over." I walked back to the house, and behind me I heard him say nothing, and that nothing was more frightening than anything he might have said. The meeting Dominic called 2 days later changed everything. He sent a formal note to Nate requesting a meeting at the ranch to present a final resolution to the debt situation. He would be bringing his legal representative. The note was polite and precise and entirely ominous. The evening before the meeting, Nate found me on the cottage porch. He sat down in the second chair, which he had never done before. For a while we just sat, watching the sky go through its colors over the hills to the west. "If it comes to it," he said, "I can raise some of the debt. Not all of it, but enough to demonstrate good faith. I've been in contact with a cattle buyer in Tucson." "That won't be enough for Dominic," I said. "He doesn't want the money. He wants the land." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about what you said. About me being alone on this land for so long, I forgot what it was supposed to be for." I looked at him. "I don't think I've forgotten," he said. "I think I've been waiting. Not consciously, but waiting." The sky was very orange above the western hills. "I need to tell you something," he said. "Dominic came to see me yesterday, alone. He made me an offer." I turned to face him. "What kind of offer?" "He said if I let you go, stopped employing you, and made clear you weren't welcome here, he'd tear up the note. No lawyers, no proceedings. The debt disappears." I felt the cold stone settle again. "What did you say?" Nate looked out at the hills. I told him no. I was very still. "I told him," Nate said carefully, "that this was your home as long as you chose it to be, and that his ability to make financial threats didn't give him the right to make decisions for you." He paused. "And I told him that if he sent his man near your cottage again, we'd be having a different conversation." I looked at Nathaniel Harlo in the golden evening light and thought about the man in the dark kitchen turning a cold cup in his hands, and the distance between that man and this one, and how much of that distance we had crossed together without either of us noticing the crossing. "Thank you," I said. "I didn't do it for gratitude," he said. "I know," I said. "That's why it means what it means." The next morning came clear and cool, and by 10 o'clock Dominic arrived with a man named Prescott, who carried a leather case and had the careful, contained manner of an attorney who was very good at his job. Dominic was composed and pleasant. He arranged the documents on the kitchen table with the practiced ease of someone who had done this before and expected to win. Ruth arrived at 11, which Nate had arranged. She sat to his left and said nothing, but her presence was steadying in the way of someone who has seen a great deal and is not frightened. Prescott laid out the terms. The full amount of the debt was due within 30 days. Failure to pay would result in foreclosure proceedings on the property and assets. There was an alternative proposal, Dominic's proposed stake in the operation, which remained on the table. Nate listened. His face was very still. Then he looked at me and gave the smallest nod. I reached into the pocket of my apron and took out a folded set of papers. "Before we discuss terms," I said, "I'd like Mr. Prescott to look at something." Dominic's attention sharpened. "Clara, this is a business." "Then let's be businesslike," I said. I unfolded the papers and laid them in front of Prescott. He looked at them, and his professional composure tightened almost imperceptibly. "These are copies," I said. "The originals are held securely with a third party outside this room. What you're looking at is the original promissory note, side by side with 3 examples of Robert Harlo's verified signature from his will and 2 land deeds." I pointed to the signatures. "The signature on the promissory note is different. The letter formation, the pressure, the angle of the R in Robert. I'm not a document expert, but I believe a court would want to examine this carefully." The room was very quiet. "There's also," I said, unfolding the second document, "a letter in Dominic's handwriting addressed to a business associate in Philadelphia, dated 14 months ago, in which he discusses the strategy of acquiring distressed ranch properties in Arizona territory through the enforcement of disputed historical debts." I set it on the table. "He describes this specific approach in some detail. I had found this letter at the very bottom of the bundle weeks ago. and had not understood its significance until I had the context to read it correctly. It had been included in the papers, I suspected, because Dominic had not expected anyone else to ever see the contents of that drawer. Prescott was very still, looking at the documents. Dominic's composure was still intact, but something behind his eyes had shifted into something harder and more exposed. "Where did you get those?" he said. And it was not quite a question. "From your desk drawer," I said, "and the night I left Boston. The night I wasn't sure why I took them. I think I knew even then that I might need them." The silence stretched. Then Prescott closed his leather case and said, "Mr. Ashford, I need a moment with you outside." Dominic rose. He looked at me across the table with an expression that was no longer pleasant or managed. It was the face underneath the face, and it was not kind. "You've made a serious mistake," he said. "I made a serious mistake 11 months ago," I said, "when I agreed to marry you. Everything since then has been correction." He and Prescott went outside. Ruth poured coffee. Nate said nothing, but he reached across the table and briefly covered my hand with his just for a moment, before moving away. 30 minutes later, Prescott came back in alone. "My client is prepared to discuss restructuring the debt," he said. "He acknowledges that the validity of the original note may require further examination. He proposes withdrawing the foreclosure proceedings in exchange for a modest extension." Nate's lawyer, who had arrived quietly from town at 10:30 and had been sitting in the corner saying nothing, leaned forward and said, "We'll need the note returned to the Harlo estate pending authentication, and we'll be filing a complaint with the territory court regarding the transfer clause." Prescott looked unhappy. "I'll need to consult." "You do that," said Nate's lawyer pleasantly. Ruth and I went to make more coffee. From the kitchen window, I could see Dominic standing in the yard, looking at the hills. His posture, always so composed, had something different in it now. Something that had been held up very tightly for a long time had let go. Later, much later, after Prescott had taken a set of agreements back to Dominic for consideration, and everyone had left, and the ranch had gone quiet in the long afternoon way it did, I sat on the porch of the main house with Nate. "It's not over," I said. "He'll negotiate. His lawyers will push back." "Yes," Nate said, "but the ground has shifted." "Yes," I agreed. We watched Clem and Walt moving cattle in the lower pasture. The afternoon was warm and very clear. "Clara," Nate said. "Yes." "When this is resolved, when the legal situation is settled," he stopped, tried again. "I'd like to discuss what happens next." "What happens next," I said, "is that this ranch goes on, with better records and a legitimate debt structure and probably new cattle from the Tucson buyer." "That's not what I meant," he said. "I know," I said. "I was giving you time to figure out how to say what you meant." The corner of his mouth moved. "I'm not good at this." "You're better than you think," I said. "I'd like you to stay," he said, "not as the cook." I looked at him in the afternoon light. This man who had opened his dark kitchen to me without knowing what he was doing, who had stood between me and a threat without calculating the cost, who had refused an offer that would have been easier to accept. "Ask me properly," I said. He turned to face me, and what I saw in his expression was the man without the walls, the man who had been in there the whole time behind the stillness and the distance. "Clara Whitfield," he said, "I am asking you to stay. On this ranch, in this house, as my partner in every sense of that word. I am asking because you have made this place something it hasn't been in years, which is a place I want to come home to. I'm asking because you are the most capable and honest and unexpectedly brave person I've met. And because when you're not here, the kitchen feels wrong and the whole house feels wrong, and I have been alone long enough to know the difference between being alone and missing someone." He paused. "And I'm asking because I am, in a way I didn't expect and didn't plan for, entirely in love with you." I was quiet for a moment. "I'll need to consult," I said. He blinked. 30 minutes, I said. "In the kitchen. I'll give you an answer after I finish the bread." The corner of his mouth moved again. And this time it went all the way, a full, genuine, startled smile. And I understood that I would spend the rest of my life being glad to have caused it. 30 minutes, he said. I want to tell this part of the story carefully, because it deserves to be told with care. I did not go to the north wing of the house looking for anything. I want to be clear about that. I went because the door at the end of the hall, the one that was always closed, had been left open by some accident of the afternoon wind, and when I passed it on my way to check on something in the linen closet, I saw the room inside. It was clearly a woman's room. The furniture was fine and delicate. The dressing table still had its small mirror, and there was a vase on the windowsill with the dried remnants of flowers that had been placed there years ago. Everything was covered in a thin layer of dust that had settled gently over things no one had touched in a long time. Eleanor's room. I should have closed the door and walked away. I did close it, partially, and stood with my hand on the doorframe for a moment before the honest part of myself won the argument, and I stepped inside. I was not looking for anything specific, but the human eye finds what is out of place, and what was out of place was the small drawer of the dressing table slightly open, as though someone had recently been in it and not fully closed it after. Inside was a bundle of letters tied with ribbon. They were not addressed to Nate. I should not have read them. I read 2 of them, enough to understand what I was looking at. Eleanor Harlo had been in correspondence with a man in California, a man she addressed with a tenderness and an urgency that was unmistakable. The letters were from perhaps 4 years ago, before she died. She had been leaving, not in a grief-stricken or impulsive way, in a planned and deliberate way. She had a route. She had an arrangement. She had been a woman who had decided on something and was moving toward it. I closed the drawer and went to find Silas. I did not have to say much. Silas had been at the ranch longer than anyone, had been there the day Eleanor's horse came back without her, had been there through the 3 days she survived in the doctor's care before she died of her injuries. He was a man who had carried something a long time, and the weight of it showed in how he moved. He told me the truth because I asked directly, and because I think after all this time, he needed someone to know. Eleanor had been leaving the morning her horse threw her. She had been riding toward the eastern road, toward the stage route, with a bag strapped behind the saddle. She had been in a hurry, or perhaps distracted, or perhaps the horse had simply startled at the wrong moment. No one would ever know exactly what happened. What Silas knew, because he had been there, was that Eleanor had been conscious in those first hours. And what she had said, before she drifted into the fever that eventually took her, was that she was sorry she had not been brave enough sooner. She had not been happy. She had not said a word of this to Nate because she had not known how, or because she had been protecting him, or because she was Eleanor, and she had always managed her own feelings alone. And then she had died trying to leave, and Nate had spent 3 years believing it was his failure. I went to Nate's office. He looked up when I came in, and something in my face told him this was not an ordinary conversation, because he put down what he was holding immediately. I told him what I had found. I told him what the letters suggested. I told him what Silas had said. I told him all of it in a quiet voice, sitting across the desk from him, watching his face and not looking away. He went very still. Then, after a long time, he put his elbows on the desk and covered his face with his hands, and his shoulders moved once, and when he looked up, his eyes were wet. "She didn't tell me," he said. "No, I didn't know." "I know," I said. "And that's not the same as failing." He looked at the surface of the desk. "I've been thinking for 3 years that if I had been different, if I had been more—" "You couldn't have given her what she wanted," I said gently. "Not because you weren't enough. Because what she wanted was somewhere else. That was her truth, not a verdict on you." He was quiet for a very long time. Then he said, with the careful effort of a man sorting through something that has been compressed for years under a great weight, "I think I have been staying in this grief because it felt like the only honest thing to do. Like stopping would mean it hadn't mattered." "It mattered," I said. It will always have mattered, but you can carry it differently. He looked at me. You make things very clear, he said. It's easier from the outside, I said. Yes, he said. He was quiet again. Then, does this change what I said to you on the porch? No, I said. Does it change what I was about to tell you in the kitchen? He looked at me with an expression that was raw and open in a way I had not seen from him before. What were you going to tell me? He said. Yes, I said. That was what I was going to tell you. Yes. He sat very still. Yes, he said, as though trying the word. Yes, I said. He came around the desk and took my hands, and we stood in his office in the afternoon light. And it was not romantic in the way that stories usually describe. It was quieter than that, more real than that, the kind of moment that does not need dressing up because it is already exactly what it is. The final confrontation came 10 days later, and it did not look the way I had expected. Dominic had not left Sulphur Creek. He had been at the boarding house, apparently, conducting what I imagined were a series of increasingly frustrating conversations with Prescott about the deteriorating legal position of the promissory note. The territory court had accepted the filing questioning the document's authenticity. 2 handwriting experts had been located, one in Tucson and one in Phoenix, who were willing to examine the signatures. Dominic arrived at the ranch on a Friday morning with Prescott, Rex Dunmore, and a kind of cold, controlled fury that was more frightening than any of the previous versions of him I had seen. He did not request a meeting this time. He simply arrived. His hired man, Rex, positioned himself near the barn with an air of casual menace that was not casual at all. Prescott carried his leather case. Nate came out of the house. I came out behind him. Ruth had arrived an hour earlier, which in retrospect suggests she knew something was coming before we did. Earl and Silas were visible at the edge of the yard. I'm done negotiating, Dominic said. He was speaking to Nate, but his eyes were on me. The note stands. Whatever these document questions are, they will take months to resolve in court, and in the meantime the debt is due. Pay it or vacate the property. Prescott opened his case and began to remove papers. Nate said very quietly, Mr. Ashford, I think you should hear what we've found. I'm not interested in Rex Dunmore, said Ruth from the side of the yard, is wanted for theft of documentation in Maricopa County. I took the liberty of sending a description to the marshal's office in Tucson 3 days ago. She held up a piece of paper. The marshal arrives this afternoon. Rex moved, and Earl and Silas moved to respond to that motion in the unhurried way of men who have handled difficult situations before. And after a moment, Rex was very still again. Dominic looked at Ruth. He looked at Nate. He looked at me. I stepped forward. The signature on the promissory note is not Robert Harlo's signature, I said. The filing with the territory court includes a detailed comparison prepared by a document examiner in Tucson. Your lawyer has a copy of that filing. I looked at Prescott. I believe he received it yesterday. Prescott's expression confirmed this. You've been operating a scheme, I said to Dominic, involving falsified historical debt instruments to acquire distressed properties across Arizona territory. This is not the only ranch. We have correspondence between you and your partner in Phoenix that outlines the approach in some detail. I held up the letter, the one from the bottom of the bundle, the one he had written 14 months ago and not expected anyone to find. This is the original. The copy is with the court. Dominic looked at the letter in my hand. Something happened in his face that I had never seen before in all the months I had known him. The composure did not crack. It did not shift. It simply went away, like a curtain pulled back, and what was behind it was smaller than I had expected. You took that from my private. From your unlocked drawer, I said. On the night I left. I didn't know what it was. I've spent 3 months learning. The silence in the yard was very complete. Prescott closed his leather case. Mr. Ashford, he said, I need to advise you strongly. I know what you're going to advise, Dominic said. His voice was level and flat. He looked at me for a long moment. I thought he might say something, one of the things men like him say when they have lost, about regret or mistakes or the idea that this could have gone differently. Instead, he said nothing. He turned and walked toward his horse. Rex was collected an hour later by a deputy who had ridden ahead of the Tucson marshal. Prescott departed with a quiet, professional relief that suggested he had known for some time that his client was more than he had been willing to see. Victoria Ashford was at the boarding house when Ruth and I went into town that afternoon for supplies. She was in the lobby with her trunk waiting for the eastbound stage. She looked at me when I came through the door, and I looked at her, and neither of us said anything for a moment. Then she said, "I told you he was wrong about you." "You were right," I said. She looked past me out the window at the red street and the blue sky and the mountains in the distance. Something in her face was tired in a way that was separate from travel fatigue. "He's been wrong about a lot of things," she said, "for a long time." I did not say anything to that. There was nothing useful to say. The stage came at 3 o'clock, and she got on it, and it took her east, and I watched it go and then went to find Ruth, and we bought flour and salt and coffee and a quantity of dried apples that would last through winter, and we drove back to the ranch in the long, late afternoon light. Nate was at the fence when we came back, looking out at the cattle in the south pasture. He turned when he heard the cart and came to help with the supplies, and when we had carried everything into the kitchen, and Ruth had made her goodbyes and headed back to her own house, Nate and I stood in the kitchen together in the particular quiet that follows something being finished. "It's not entirely resolved," I said. "The court proceedings will take time." "Yes," he said, "but the note won't hold." "No," I agreed. "It won't." He leaned against the counter and crossed his arms and looked at me in the way he had developed recently of looking at me, as though he was still slightly surprised by the fact of me, and found the surprise pleasant. "I want to ask you something," he said. "You can ask me anything," I said. "I know," he said. "I know I can, and I know that's not a small thing." He looked at his hands for a moment, then back at me. "I want to ask you properly. Not on a porch in the middle of a legal situation, not after a crisis, not as an extension of everything that's been happening." He reached into his shirt pocket and placed something on the counter between us. It was a key. An old key, worn smooth with a small tag attached that read in faded ink, "North Wing." "I've been carrying this since Eleanor died," he said. "I locked that door the week after the funeral, and I've been carrying the key ever since. I think," he paused, "I think I was waiting to give it to someone. I think that's what I've been doing all this time, without knowing it." I looked at the key on the counter. "I want you to have every key to this house," he said. "Every room, every door, everything I've kept locked. I want you to marry me, Clara. Not because of the legal situation, not because of Dominic, not because of anything practical. Because you walked into this place, and you didn't try to change what it was. You just made it better by being in it. Because you make sense to me in a way I stopped believing people could." He met my eyes. "Will you marry me?" I looked at Nathaniel Harlo in his kitchen in the late afternoon light of an Arizona September, and I thought about the morning I had stood on a Boston train platform with 3 things that did not belong to me and a ticket to somewhere I had never been. I thought about the fear of that morning, and the relief underneath the fear, and the promise I had made to myself about not shrinking. I picked up the key. "Yes," I said, "with conditions." His mouth moved. "I expected nothing less. Equal say in all major decisions. Done. I continue managing the books and the supply orders. I'm better at it than you." Inarguably true. "And I want to expand the kitchen garden in the spring. There's good light on the south side of the barn, and we're spending too much on vegetables we could grow ourselves." He looked at me for a moment. "That last one isn't a condition," he said. "That's just good ranch management." "I know," I said. "I just wanted to say it." He laughed. It was the full laugh. The unguarded one I had been collecting over months the way you collect things that are rare and worth keeping. It filled the kitchen. "Yes," he said. "Clara Whitfield. Yes to all of it." We were married in November, 6 weeks after the morning of the final confrontation in the yard, on a day that was clear and very cold, and smelled of wood smoke, and the particular clean quality that Arizona air takes on in the late autumn. The ceremony was at the ranch. Ruth organized it, which meant it was practical and lovely in equal measure, with no unnecessary ornamentation and no shortage of food. Silas stood with Nate. Ruth stood with me. Walt and Earl and young Clem, who had grown 3 inches since September and was still growing, sat in the front row and were very nearly well behaved. The minister came from town on a borrowed horse and said the right words in a straightforward manner that I appreciated. I wore a dress I had made myself in the weeks leading up to the wedding, a deep blue wool that was practical enough for a working ranch and fine enough for the occasion. And when I came out of the cottage that morning, Ruth looked at me and said, "Good, you look like yourself," which was the best thing anyone could have said. Nate stood at the front of the assembled gathering with his hat in his hands and his best shirt on. And when I walked toward him, he looked at me with that expression I had first seen in his office the evening of the North Wing, the one without the walls. And it was still, months later, the most moving thing I had ever seen. We said our vows. They were simple, and we meant them. There was a dinner afterward that went on until well past dark, with Ruth's cooking supplementing my own because she had opinions about the pie situation that I had eventually surrendered to. Walt produced a fiddle from somewhere and played it with more enthusiasm than skill, and Clem danced with such earnest effort that we all applauded regardless of the results. Silas gave a toast that was 3 sentences long and contained, in those 3 sentences, more genuine feeling than most speeches 10 times the length. He said, "This ranch has been waiting for something. I think it found it. Welcome home, Mrs. Harlo." I did not cry during the ceremony. I cried at that. The legal proceedings regarding the promissory note were resolved the following spring, as Nate had expected they would be. The territory court found the signature on the original document to be inconsistent with verified examples of Robert Harlo's handwriting, and the note was declared invalid. Dominic Ashford faced a separate inquiry regarding other properties in the territory, the details of which I received in a letter from Ruth, who had a remarkable network of correspondences, and which resolved in a manner that was less dramatic than he deserved but more consequential than he had planned for. I never heard from him directly again. Rex Dunmore served a term in the territorial prison at Yuma, and was thereafter, as far as I know, someone else's problem. Victoria wrote to me once from Philadelphia, a brief and rather formal letter that acknowledged, without entirely apologizing, that she had been more complicit in her brother's plans than she had let on during our kitchen conversation. She said she hoped things had turned out well. I wrote back and said they had. We did not correspond further, but I found to my own surprise that I held no particular anger toward her. She had told me the truth when she had no clear reason to, and that was worth something. Ruth came to dinner every Sunday for the rest of the time I was on that ranch, which was the rest of my life, and she became as much a fixture of the household as the kitchen stove, which required regular maintenance, but was entirely reliable and warmed everything it touched. Silas retired from riding the range when his knees gave out for good, and Nate gave him the small room off the barn that had good southern exposure and no drafts, and he spent his remaining years telling the younger hands stories that were mostly true and deeply instructive. Clem grew into a steady, reliable man who eventually became foreman. Walt married a woman from town named Helen, who immediately improved his fiddle playing by the simple method of never letting him play it after 9 o'clock. Earl had a dog named Captain who believed himself to be a cattle dog of the highest caliber and was entirely wrong about this, but very committed to the belief, and the cattle grew accustomed to him, which is perhaps the most useful form of optimism. In the spring after our wedding, we expanded the kitchen garden along the south side of the barn, and I was right about the light, and we never paid too much for vegetables again. There are things I want to say about marriage to Nathaniel Harlo that are difficult to put into words without either understating or overstating them. He was not easy. He never became easy in the way that some people do when they have been loved well for a long time. He remained a man of few words and considerable silences, a man who expressed most of his feelings through action rather than articulation, who would repair a fence post you had mentioned only in passing without being asked, and never mention having done it. But he was honest every day in every exchange between us. He never managed me or handled me or arranged me to suit his convenience. He asked my opinion and waited for it and considered it seriously. And when we disagreed, which we did with some regularity because we were both stubborn in our different ways, he disagreed directly and expected me to do the same, and we always found our way back to each other. He kept his promise about the keys. Every door in that house was mine, including the ones he had kept locked for a long time, including the ones I did not know existed until he opened them. I think often about the woman I was on the train leaving Boston, the one with 3 things that did not belong to her, and a ticket to somewhere she had never been, and a promise to herself about not shrinking. I think about how little I knew, how afraid I was beneath the relief, how entirely I could not have imagined what was waiting in Sulphur Creek. I did not go west to find love. I went west to find myself again after I had spent nearly a year bending out of shape for someone else's convenience. The love was not in the plan. It arrived because I stopped running away and started running toward honest work and honest people and the version of myself that did not fit in Boston drawing rooms, but fit very well in a large ranch kitchen with good light and a complicated man who had been waiting without knowing it for someone to come in and remind him what the house was for. I am Clara Whitfield Harlo. I am the cook, the bookkeeper, the person who remembers which hands have bad stomachs and which ones have a weakness for apple pie. I am the woman who learned to ride in the Arizona style and to read a promissory note and to stand in a yard full of uncertainty and speak clearly anyway. I am the woman who tamed the fire. Or perhaps more accurately, the woman who walked into a ranch that was already burning low and stayed until it burned properly again, with heat and light and something to warm yourself by. The morning after our wedding, I came into the kitchen before dawn, as I always did, and I built up the fire in the stove and set the coffee on and started the bread. The kitchen was warm and dark and smelled of wood smoke and something yeasty and good. Nate came in while I was working, in the way he had developed of coming in quietly and sitting at the table without making a production of it, and I heard his chair, and I did not turn around. "Coffee in 10 minutes, I said. "I know," he said. We were quiet together in the warm, dark kitchen, the fire building, the bread rising, the day waiting outside to be worked and lived and made into something. "Clara," he said. "Yes, you were right about the kitchen garden." "I know," I said. "You don't have to sound so pleased about it." "I absolutely do," I said. He was quiet for a moment, and then he made a sound that was low and warm and entirely content. And I turned to look at him, this man in his kitchen in the early dark, with his coffee cup and his whole life reorganized around something he had not seen coming. He looked back at me. "Good morning, Mrs. Harlo," he said. "Good morning, Mr. Harlo," I said. Outside, the sun was coming up over the eastern hills the way it did every morning in Arizona, enormous and red and indifferent to human drama. The cattle were moving in the lower pasture. Somewhere Earl's dog Captain was barking at the cattle with his characteristic misplaced confidence. Young Clem would be in the barn within the hour. The day was waiting. I turned back to the bread and let the morning begin. This is where the story ends. Not because nothing happened after, but because everything that happened after was built on this: a kitchen, a fire, a man and a woman who had both been through the burning and come out the other side, choosing each other in the ordinary morning light. That is enough. That is, in fact, everything.